I'm James Garza, a literary translator from Japanese. If you're thinking about entering the Stephen Spender Prize for Poetry and Translation, or you just want to learn more about translation in general, then you've come to the right place. In this video, I'll introduce you to some ideas about translation that you might find helpful, thought-provoking, or even challenging to your own views about translation. So, in the first half of the video, I'll explore some background ideas about what translation is and can be, while in the second half of the video, I'll take you through my process for translating a kind of Japanese poem known as a tanka. For more on how to enter the Stephen Spender Prize, as well as practical tips and other guidance, I encourage you to explore some of the other videos on this channel and visit stephenspender.org. So I've titled this video, How I Translate Sometimes, because I wanted to try and get across the idea that there's no one right way to translate. You might decide that certain strategies are more appropriate than others, depending on the situation. It depends in part on what you want to accomplish with your translation, as well as the expectations that other people bring to your text. This leads me to the first background idea that I wanted to discuss. If there's no one right way to translate a poem, this suggests that there are many ways. In fact, when it comes to translation choices, one translation scholar has argued that there is always an alternative. This is the Tiana principle. No matter what words you use in your translation, there are always some other words that you might have chosen instead. Maybe, instead of using the word dog, you find your translation does something more interesting when you substitute hound or mutt. What about function words like the or in that don't have any obvious synonyms? Aren't we stuck with those? I would argue not necessarily. If you try rewriting at the level of the phrase, you might find an alternative expression that works better in your translation. I try to keep this principle in mind whenever I feel stuck with my own translation work, whenever it feels like it's not going anywhere. It's helpful to remind myself that there are always other options, even if I haven't found them yet. This leads me to my second background idea. If translation involves choices, then at some level, translation is about how you have interpreted the source text. As another translation theorist has argued, translation is an interpretive act that always transforms the source text. In other words, translation is not a window that lets you see the source text directly. The words you choose in your translation may correspond in certain ways to the words in the original text, but at the end of the day, they have a history and a life of their own in English. Not only that, but the context in which your translation is read is different from that of the original. Also, it's good to keep in mind that ideas about what constitute a quote-unquote faithful translation have changed over time. So, what was considered a close translation 200 years ago might seem like more of an adaptation to us now. And these ideas will no doubt continue to change in the future. So, how do we know if we've gone too far in our interpretation? I once heard the translator from Korean, Deborah Smith, answer this question in a presentation. She said, often we don't know if we've gone too far until the translation is already out there and people tell us that we have. But I think the important thing is to translate anyway. And one of the great things about the Stephen Spender Prize is that it allows you to write a commentary about your translation where you can talk about the choices you've made and why you've made them. This leads me to my third and final background idea. When I translate poetry, I'm personally interested in making a text that can stand on its own, but that still resonates with the source text. This is what Barbara Folkart has called poetically viable translation. It doesn't seek to merely imitate the first poem, it seeks to reenact it, to perform it for a new audience. It's focused on translation as writing, not just reading. In other words, it's important that we try to make our translations our own. Now, this doesn't mean that the translation no longer has any relationship to the source text, but it does mean paying attention to the way that poems work in the language we're translating into. So, how can we make a translation our own? I would suggest first finding out what kind of poems you like in English. How do they make you feel? And how do they accomplish that effect? Are there aspects of style that good writers use that you can learn from when you go about writing your translation? And it's equally important to ask, are there things that the source poem does that might make the English in your translation stand out even more? With these three background ideas in mind, let's look at an example of Japanese poetry. The poem we'll be looking at today is an example of a tanka. Tanka is a short form of Japanese poem with a long history. It was one of the main forms of classical Japanese poetry, although in that context it's usually referred to as a waka. Tanka are usually described as being broken up into 5 sections, with a particular number of syllables in each section. 5, 7, 5, 7, 7, but not always. Also, the term syllable isn't exactly correct when it comes to Japanese, but we'll leave that aside. Tanka eventually came to be written collaboratively, and in fact, the popular haiku genre derives from the 5-7-5 portion of the tanka. So tanka are longer than haiku. Finally, while tanka are often translated into 5 lines in English, in Japanese the whole poem is typically printed out in one unbroken line. Now, here's the poem I want to look at today. In Japanese it reads, Ie no uchi, nabe nado sagete, yuki kaeru, yugure ni kiku, akisame no oto. Don't worry, I'll show you how to read it in a second. There we go. Once more. Ie no uchi, nabe nado sagete, yuki kaeru, yugure ni kiku, akisame no oto. So it's got that wonderful tanka rhythm that you can hear. This poem is by one of my favorite tanka writers, Mikajima Yoshiko, although sometimes you see her referred to as Mikashima Yoshiko. I've chosen one of her tanka because I like the down-to-earth imagery, and she was really good at letting you hear the breaks in the tanka form. Now, the first thing I do when translating a tanka is to break it up and look at any words I don't know. If you're new to Japanese, it might help to diagram the poem like this. So, as we can see here, the first section is about the inside of a house, ie no uchi, the inside of a house. The second section has to do with carrying a pot or pots and things like that. The third is about going back and forth. The fourth section is about hearing something at dusk, and the fifth section is about the sound of autumn rain. Now, clearly this is going to take some interpretation to turn into a poetically viable translation. In some poetic traditions, it's common to use information from the author's life to help you interpret their poetry. And I would argue that's appropriate here. It's helpful to know that the poet, Mikajima Yoshiko, lived a more or less hardscrabble life. She often lived in poverty, and at the time she wrote this poem, she was living in a rundown house. In fact, what we have here is a poem about someone with a leaky roof, putting pots around the house to catch the rainwater leaking in. Grammatically speaking, the poem ends with a noun phrase, akisame no oto, the sound of autumn rain. And one way of reading this poem is that everything before this, sections 1, 2, 3, and 4, all of that modifies section 5. So that would give us something like the following. The sound of autumn rain heard at dusk as I go back and forth inside the house carrying pots and such. But because of the way that section 3 is conjugated, this could also be the end of its own sentence. Tanka don't usually have punctuation, so sometimes it's hard to tell. In this reading, sections 1, 2, and 3 would form their own group, and sections 4 and 5 would form another group. This would give us something like, I go back and forth inside the house with pots and such, the sound of autumn rain heard at dusk. Neither of these is bad, but at the same time, they don't entirely satisfy me. They do sound a little like translationese, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes that's just what a poem needs, in my opinion. Nevertheless, this is what my rough drafts often look like. Now, from here is the challenging and rewarding part. I want to see if I can come up with anything better than what I've got already. So I had a look through an old notebook of mine, and this was my first draft. Pots and pans all around. What you hear in them is autumn rain. And I kind of like this one. The staggered lines give me a sense of the house being in kind of disarray. And the second line suggests that what you should be hearing in the pots and pans is food cooking, but the speaker is so poor that all she has in them is rain at the moment. But at the same time, this draft de-emphasizes some of what I really like about the original. I like the idea of the speaker frantically going back and forth, although that's missing here. Also, I've just noticed that the time of day in which this is happening is missing in this draft, dusk or twilight. So I write another draft. Here's my second draft. Back and forth inside the house with pots and pans, how it rains this autumn evening. This time I translated the poem into 5 lines because the previous one sort of looked more like a haiku than a tanka. Or it looked like how haiku are often translated into English, into 3 lines. I like the rhythm of this one, back and forth inside the house with pots and pans. I also experimented in line 3. I used an abbreviation for the word with to try and suggest something of the diary-like function that tanka serves for a lot of writers. But on second thought, I'm not so sure that I like it all that much. Also, while the exclamation point at the end of the poem suggests a kind of intensity or loudness, it's not exactly the loudness of the rain hitting the pots and pans. So, I translated the poem a third time. Here's my third draft. Plinking into pots and pans around the house, autumn rain at twilight. This time I tried to emphasize the sound of the rain itself, so I've used the onomatopoeia plinking. I also reintroduced the staggered lines from my first draft to try and suggest something of the disorder of the house. All in all, I kind of like this one better than my second draft, but I wonder if I can do better. So I translate the poem again. Here's my fourth draft. It's dusk. The kitchenware is everywhere. The house is loud with autumn rain. In this draft, I really like the repeated sound where. The kitchenware is everywhere. But at the same time, it's not totally clear that the speaker has expressly set out the pots and pans to catch the leaking rainwater. But I kind of like it anyway. It makes you work a little to put the pieces together. So what will my final draft look like? At this point, I'm not so sure. The process of writing multiple drafts is not necessarily one in which you go from bad to good, or from good to better to best. Sometimes you might find that you like your first versions the best, or you may like different aspects of each draft as I have here. When this happens, I usually like to leave my drafts alone for a few days. I set them aside and come back to them with fresh eyes. While it's true that a lot of considerations come into play, I usually choose the one that seems the freshest to me. I choose the draft that seems the most exciting to me. And more than that, I often have the 3 background ideas we talked about earlier in mind when I translate. To recap, number 1 was the Tiana principle. There is always another way to translate something. Number 2, everything you do transforms the original, and that's a really important thing to be aware of. And number 3, it's really important to ask yourself, does your translation stand as its own text? So those are the main ideas I wanted to talk about today, and I thank you for watching. If you found this video at all to be helpful or interesting, please remember to like and subscribe, and I do hope that you can try your own hand at translating a poem soon, and I hope that you can enter the Stephen Spender Prize. Thanks very much.